Ethan, despite being an alpha himself, had fallen deeply in love with his own alpha stepbrother. Yet, on the day his quiet devotion was brought to light, his brother sent him away to the isolated sanctuary, a secluded retreat meant for alphas who harbored the same unconventional affections for their own kind. It was within those desolate walls that Ethan navigated the darkest, most profoundly lonely chapter of his life. But from those shadows, a new dawn eventually broke. Leaving the bitter past behind, Ethan made a different choice. He accepted the heartfelt proposal of a top-tier Enigma. The suffocating ache receded like an outgoing tide. Ethan's eyelashes fluttered wildly as he was coaxed awake by a ray of warm, tangerine morning light filtering through the window panes. Main text. A soft golden-pink halo seemed to float in the air. It was his mother's hand, resting with a comforting warmth against his forehead, which was dotted with a fine layer of dew. "What's wrong, sweetheart? Did you have a bad dream?" Her voice was edged with a tender, velvety softness, wrapped in the delicate interplay of light and shadow. Ethan's pupils constricted, a flush of emotion quickly gathering at the corners of his eyes. He drank in the sight of her face, the very face he had prayed to see 1,000 times in the desolate halls of that isolated sanctuary. His Adam's apple bobbed as he bit down hard on his lower lip, swallowing the choked sob that threatened to spill out. Across the sun-drenched breakfast table, Edward had his head bowed, carefully placing a boneless piece of fish onto the white porcelain plate of the Omega sitting beside him. Bathed in the morning light, the Alpha's profile looked impossibly tender. His eyes were entirely filled with a soft indulgence, not sparing even a fraction of a glance for Ethan. Ethan gripped the tablecloth, his knuckles turning pale, and offered his mother a slow shake of his head. He had been reborn. He had returned to the exact day Edward brought this beautiful Omega home. Memories of his past life flashed through his mind like faded film negatives. It had been this very same cozy breakfast. The Alpha, whose fingers had been tightly intertwined with his just the night before, had casually dropped a phrase that shattered Ethan's entire world, him getting married. Let's leave the past behind. The broken porcelain on the floor, paired with Ethan's red, tear-stained eyes, had marked the end of that farce. Hurt and reckless, Ethan had fled back to his room. When Edward pushed open the door, the gravity in the room seemed to double in an instant. The air rippled with a deep, mesmerizing shadow that glided across the floor, wrapping around Ethan with the gentle but irresistible presence of an unbreakable bond. It was the absolute, undeniable pull of a top-tier alpha. Ethan stumbled, his chest heaving, watching helplessly as the man lit a cigarette, the spark at his fingertips flickering in the dimness. "Edward, you jerk. What do you mean? Leave it behind." Ethan surged forward like a creature backed into a corner, pressing Edward firmly against the wall. In his loss of control, his own alpha energy burst forth, brilliant crimson sparks blooming in the air, carrying a desperate moth to a flame resolve as they tried to burn through the shadows. Yet, Edward merely lifted his gaze. In a heartbeat, a heavier, velvety darkness cascaded from him like a quiet avalanche. In just a second, it enveloped those crimson sparks, softly dissolving them into drifting ash. Ethan clutched tightly at the crumpled fabric of Edward's shirt, heavy tears falling onto the back of his own hand. The past 3 years, did they mean nothing? White smoke mingled with the deepening shadows. Edward's eyes were cooler than frosted glass. 2 alphas together? Daunt, you find it absurd? Gone was the tender, restrained comfort of the past, replaced only by a sweeping, overwhelming finality. As Edward turned away, that heavy shadow dismantled whatever remained of Ethan's pride. Under the bright, unyielding lights of the hallway, the fragile Omega curled into Edward's embrace. Catching a trace of Ethan's scent, he covered his nose in distaste. This scent is so unsettling. Ethan reached out with trembling hands, wanting to hold on to Edward. In the next moment, an undeniable tension locked around his wrist. Edward's hand closed over his with an unyielding weight. The sheer magnetism and immense pressure of his hold made Ethan's fingertips turn pale, a cold sweat tracing his tense jawline. Those emotionless eyes declared a complete shift in their world. The man who now controlled the family no longer needed his brother in name. If Hez unwell, send him to the sanctuary to recover. That was the last definitive decree Ethan heard in his past life. Within the walls of that cold, isolated fortress, his spirit had quietly slipped away into silence. A sudden, deep pang in his chest jolted Ethan back from those haunting memories. He took a sharp breath. As his eyelashes lifted, he unexpectedly collided with Edward's deep, searching gaze across the table. No demands, no pleas to stay. In Ethan's eyes, there was only the quiet serenity of someone waking from a long, exhausting dream. He lowered his slightly reddened eyes, avoiding that gaze. He sealed away the memories of Angus' prestigious background and the bitter end he had met at the sanctuary, locking them all safely within this tranquil, warm morning light. This time, he would not let a single tear of despair fall from his mother's eyes. A pair of slender hands abruptly interrupted the beam of sunlight. Edward placed a beautifully glistening piece of meat onto Ethan's porcelain plate. "It's your favorite. Why aren't you eating?" A gentle, sunlit smile touched the corners of Ethan's lips as his fingertips lightly pushed the plate half an inch away. "My tastes have changed." Beside them, Angus arched a delicate brow, his gaze shifting between the two. "How is it that I've heard rumors about the two of you?" Ethan's smile didn't waver, his eyes as clear as morning dew. "Angus, my brother, is indeed good to me, but we are simply family." Edward's hand froze mid-air, his silver chopsticks letting out the faintest clink against the edge of the porcelain bowl. He lowered his head, his long eyelashes casting a trembling shadow over his skin. "Yes, I've always seen him as my little brother." The unspoken tension cleared, and Angus looked away. Ethan let out a silent breath, picked up his chopsticks, and pushed the piece of meat completely to the edge of his plate. When he looked up again, he was caught off guard by Edward's stare. Despite the healing warmth of the sun surrounding them, a dense, swirling shadow was quietly rising in Edward's bottomless dark eyes, carrying a soft magnetism that subtly warped the light around them. Breakfast, sunlight flooded the glass greenhouse. Holding his mother's hand, Ethan dropped a bombshell in the softest of tones. "Mom, I've decided to board at school starting next week." His mother's worried murmurs and suggestions to speak with Edward were gently deflected by Ethan's firm shake of the head. Yet, the light in the corner seemed to dim. Edward stood in the shadows like a cool marble statue, his gaze pinned to Ethan. The air temperature dropped, bringing an almost visible, misty chill, sweeping in with an undeniable protective intensity. "Your pheromones aren't stable. Boarding is too risky." Ethan straightened his back, meeting that frosty mist head on. "Brother, I've taken my medication. Imperfectly stable." During the standoff, a pair of fair hands rested lightly on Edward's arm. Angus' voice was as soft as a spring breeze. "Boarding is a wonderful idea, Edward. Hez not a child anymore." At that sweet coaxing, the dark shadows in Edward's eyes flickered. He lowered his gaze, reaching over to pat the back of Angus' hand. The cold mist in the air instantly dissolved into the warm sunlight. "All right, you can board at school." Ethan didn't spare them another glance. He turned and walked toward the stairs, leaving the reflection of the two within the pool of sunlight that had once belonged entirely to him. Early the next morning, the rising sun bathed the courtyard mist in a healing, pale gold. Ethan had purposefully taken his time, but as he pushed the front doors open with his suitcase in hand, his footsteps faltered. Beside a sleek black sedan, Edward leaned quietly against the door, the morning breeze catching the hem of his trench coat. "Get in. I'll drop you off." Ethan's knuckles turned pale where he gripped his luggage handle, but a flawless, gentle smile quickly blossomed on his face. "No need, brother. The driver can take me. You should stay and keep Angus company." Edward's brows instantly drew together, his jawline tightening into a rigid, unyielding line. Seeing Ethan standing there, as deeply unmoved as a smiling statue of white jade, he fished a lighter from his pocket. Click. The dancing flame illuminated Edward's brooding profile. He lit a cigarette, the exhaled smoke churning heavily against the pale, golden morning light. The air around them seemed to warp and tremble under a suppressed, searing heat. Even the play of light and shadow shifted into a deep, intense orange, as though the very world around them was quietly crumbling into ash. "Suit yourself." The engine purred to life, and the car glided smoothly through the wrought iron gates. Ethan leaned back against the plush seat, his gaze drifting to the rearview mirror. Framed within the glass, Edward remained rooted to the spot. The glowing tip of the cigarette between his fingers flickered in the morning mist, looking for all the world like a still, melancholic oil painting. Ethan calmly pulled his gaze away, turning toward the vibrant tree-lined avenues passing by his window. His eyes, once blinded by affection, were now exceptionally clear. The family empire, rightfully his before his father's passing, lay waiting in this gentle sunlight for its true heir. Step by careful step, he would reclaim what was his. Afternoon sunlight spilled through the dorm room windows, refracting into tiny, warm specks of golden dust in the air. Ethan was standing by the top bunk, organizing his bed, when his fingers slipped. With a soft thud, his plush comforter tumbled over the edge. Ethan leaned over to look, and his breath suddenly hitched. Below him stood a tall, broad-shouldered young man holding a suitcase, frozen in place with half of his face draped in the soft comforter. Bathed in the sunlight, the young man casually tugged the blanket away, revealing a face of striking, magnetic appeal. Deep, set brow bones and a perfectly straight nose were complemented by a crisp, lightweight black shirt that traced the smooth, powerful lines of broad shoulders and a narrow waist. He stood there like a nobleman meticulously brought to life by a master painter, radiating a cool, undeniable elegance. "I'm so sorry." Ethan leaned awkwardly against the railing, a slight flush rising to the corners of his eyes. "It's all right." A gentle heart-melting smile curved the young man's lips. His long, elegant fingers patted the corner of the comforter before offering it back up. Cheney. I guess we're roommates." At the sound of that name, Ethan's pupils dilated in shock. Cheney, the sole heir of the DuPont family. A presence rumored to be even rarer than a top-tier alpha. A natural-born enigma. "It's been a long time, Ethan." Cheney's gaze was as tender and inviting as a spring river, resting softly on Ethan's blushing cheeks. "Do you still remember that vase you broke when you visited my house as a kid?" A wave of childhood memories rushed back, and a warm, tangerine flush instantly painted Ethan's face. He looked down and took the comforter back, burying his shock and lingering defenses, along with the subtle, comforting warmth radiating from this tall man, into the softness of his bed. The hands of time moved forward. Half a year was beautifully fractured into a montage of warm, light-filled moments. The gentle breeze of turning pages in the library, a steaming cup of milk tea appearing on his desk at the same time every evening, and the lingering, comforting warmth of a jacket Cheney draped over Ethan's chair when the weather turned cold. As for the flashing text on his mother's phone about Edward and Angus moving in together and getting engaged, it failed to cause even a ripple amidst the healing tranquility of Ethan's new daily life. That was, until an early winter evening. Ethan pushed open the heavy doors of the library. Under the dim yellow glow of a street lamp, a gaunt figure blocked his path. Edward leaned against a weathered stone pillar, half a cigarette pinched between his fingers. In just 6 months, the bloodshot redness in his eyes and the hollowing of his cheekbones made him look remarkably haggard. "Are you hiding from me?" Edward stared intensely at Ethan, his dark, stormy eyes brimming with an overwhelming desperation, as if wanting to devour him whole. "No. Aren't you getting engaged to Angus?" Ethan pulled up the corners of his mouth, his gaze as tranquil as a still, unbothered pool of water. "Are you hiding something from me? Why won't you live at home?" Edward's breathing grew heavy, his jawline tightening fiercely. As his composure slipped, the air suddenly grew thick. The surrounding street lamps let out a static buzz before flickering out. A visible, dark undercurrent spread wildly from Edward's feet, reaching out like deeply rooted vines to encircle Ethan's ankles. The very space between them warped and shuddered under an intense magnetic pull. That wildly untamed manifestation of an alpha's presence drained the color from Ethan's face. He stepped back sharply, a dull, aching prickle echoing in his glands. Edward closed the distance step by step, his fingers catching Ethan's chin with an unyielding grip. "Let him go." A voice as deep and cool as a cello sliced through the stagnant air. A slender, elegantly sculpted hand reached out from the side, lightly grasping Ethan's wrist. With a gentle but irresistible pull, Ethan was drawn into a warm, broad chest. Edward furrowed his brows. "Mr. Cheney, this is a family matter." Cheney stood silhouetted against the halo of the street lamp. His impeccably tailored clothes made him look like a deity descending into the night. His gaze was sovereign, a casual, effortless smile playing on his lips. "Edward, I'm simply helping my roommate." Pushed past his breaking point, Edward's aura flared completely. The dark mist rose like a tidal wave, rushing toward the two of them with an untamed wildness. Yet, Cheney merely tilted his head. There was no violent clash, no chaotic collision of darkness. From Cheney's entire being, a pure, blinding halo of white, gold light blossomed. The radiance harbored no brutality, yet it carried the absolute, breathtaking majesty of someone naturally superior. The golden light rippled outward, silently like the tide. Wherever it touched, Edward's terrifying dark undercurrents peeled away and vanished, like morning frost meeting a blazing sun. Even the warped air was gently but firmly smoothed back into tranquility. This tangible cascade of light, a phenomenon exclusive to an Enigma, caused Edward to stagger back several steps. The once unfathomably proud top-tier alpha was now clutching his chest, panting heavily, as he stared at Cheney in utter disbelief. "Ethan, let's go." Cheney took Ethan's hand. The comforting warmth from his palm completely banished the bitter chill of the street corner. Late that night in the dorm room, the moonlight draped over the floor like a veil of silver silk. Lying in bed, Ethan clutched the edge of his blanket. It took a long while before he breathed softly toward the opposite bed. "Cheney, thank you." "No need to thank me." In the darkness, that tender yet unwavering voice felt like an anchor to his soul. "Ethan, from now on, you have me." In the late hours of the night, fleeting nightmares of his past life, the pallid lights of the sanctuary, the sharp aching pangs, flashed through his mind. Ethan woke with a start just before dawn, his forehead layered with cold sweat. But he wasn't trembling, because the moment he opened his eyes, the first healing rays of the morning sun pierced through the curtains, falling gently across his clenched fists. The dormant period of his rebirth had ended. His rightful counterattack would now, within this gentle yet unshakable morning light, officially begin. He flicked his slender fingers across the screen and pressed send, compressing several overseas calls and corporate arrangements regarding his assets into this single warm morning. Inside the tea room, the curling steam of the Urd tea traced soft floating lines in the warm light. Frank tapped his knuckles against the purple clay table, his brow heavily furrowed. Edward is being too ruthless. For the East Side development, Hez stubbornly insisting on partnering with the Kennedy family, his fiancé's household. It's a dangerous, deep water game. You need at least 30% of the shares to support you, Ethan. Frank's eyes carried both the stern scrutiny and deep worry of an elder. Ethan lifted his white porcelain teacup, its gentle heat seeping through his palms. Lifting his eyelashes, his clear eyes reflected the tea room's warm, resolute amber glow. "Uncle Frank, I will prove my value to the board." The campus paths that afternoon were paved with golden leaves, rustling softly underfoot. A 30% stake, Edward's absolute dominance, and Cheney, that enigma whose very presence was always enveloped in a soothing, white, gold halo. Ethan offered a self-deprecating smile and a gentle shake of his head, temporarily burying any thought of seeking protection into the comforting autumn breeze. However, the next day's tranquility was ruthlessly shattered by the piercing vibration of his device. The pale, cold light of the screen reflected off Ethan's suddenly bloodless face. The trending headlines were a blinding, violent crimson, high society secrets, the scandals of step-brothers. The attached photo was an old snapshot of him and Edward. Malicious comments cascaded down like dense, dark arrows, shrieking across the screen to drag him into an abyss. His fingertips trembled slightly. Ethan took a deep breath, forcing down the surging ache. His device flashed repeatedly, his mother's anxious voice and Frank's demanding questions about the crashing stock prices intertwined into a suffocating web. Lowering his eyelashes, he tightened his jaw against the pale light, his tone remarkably steady. "I will handle it." Click. The dorm room door pushed open. Accompanying Cheney's footsteps, a wave of soothing, white, gold radiance flowed silently into the room. This tangible enigma essence acted like a warm blanket, instantly banishing the coldness that had encircled Ethan. A thick stack of documents was pushed before Ethan by a pair of elegantly sculpted hands. Printed clearly on top was an agreement, showing Angus paying $500,000 to hire online trolls. This, Ethan looked up sharply, the corners of his eyes flushed with lingering shock. Cheney pulled out a chair and sat down, his long legs casually crossed. He didn't answer right away, his focus entirely on Ethan. "How do you want to handle it?" Ethan opened his mouth, but all his unspoken words ultimately dissolved into a slightly raspy, "Thank you, Cheney." A soft curve touched Cheney's lips, his white gold halo gently brushing over Ethan's tense shoulders like a living thing. "I told you, from now on you have me." Over the next 2 days, 2 more classified files appeared on the desk. Angus' history of academic fraud and the Kennedy family's commercial scandals. "Where did you get these?" Ethan couldn't help but tighten his grip on the papers. Cheney leaned lazily back in his chair, his slender fingers twirling a black fountain pen. The afternoon sun caught his deep features, and within his eyes swirled a dazzling pale gold brilliance, like a bottomless yet profoundly tender vortex. Staring into them for just 3 seconds made Ethan's heart skip a beat. Flustered, he averted his gaze, a warm crimson flush creeping up to the tips of his ears. The counterattack landed at the absolute perfect moment. With the press of the enter key, one bombshell after another was precisely unleashed onto the network. The academic fraud, the commercial scandals, the $500,000 troll contract. The tide of public opinion turned instantly, completely swallowing Angus and the Kennedy family. On screen, Angus' team issued a pale, hollow apology. Their social media accounts flooded with mockery. And through the entire storm, Edward remained entirely silent, like a pool of stagnant water. Ethan calmly shut off his screen, severing the piercing cold light. The dorm room was once again filled with the warm, golden hues of the setting sun. He quietly watched the birds spreading their wings against the evening glow, knowing that an irreparable fracture had formed between those two. But none of it mattered to him anymore. This was merely the opening move to reclaim his inheritance and heal his own life. The soft amber glow of the desk lamp created a sanctuary of quiet light. His screen lit up again, casting a cool silver glow onto Ethan's unmoved profile. "It's getting cold. Add some layers. Are you coming home for dinner this weekend?" Edward's messages arrived like cold, rhythmic lines of code, attempting to re-enter Ethan's world. Yet, Ethan merely swiped across the screen with an expressionless face, his fingers tapping out minimal detached responses. No, busy. The alpha, who once could easily derail his emotions, could no longer cause his eyelashes to flutter even a fraction. The bathroom door opened with a soft click, and the drifting warmth carried a faint trace of that comforting white gold light into the room. Cheney stepped out in tailored, dark lounge clothes, drying his damp hair with a towel. Water droplets traced the cool, sharp lines of his brow bone, disappearing past his collar. As Cheney closed the distance, his white, gold Enigma halo spread across the entire room like a velvety blanket, completely swallowing the harsh light from the device. The screen vibrated once more, and a message from Frank jumped into view. "The South Side Urban Renewal Project. Uncle Hugo wants you to take charge." Ethan's pupils sharpened, reflecting the dancing characters on the screen, and his lips finally curved into a vibrant, living smile. His slender fingers quickly typed back a response. "Good. I'll take it." "Good night, Ethan." Cheney's deep voice drifted from the opposite bed, accompanied by the gentle sway of his white gold radiance. "Good night." Ethan closed his eyes, his breathing growing perfectly rhythmic within the warm, healing air. The next 3 weeks flew by in a blur. Under the blinding midday sun, Ethan navigated the concrete and steel of the construction site in a hard hat, beads of sweat trailing down his tightly set jawline. Late at night in the dorm, blueprints piled up like mountains under the warm amber glow of his desk lamp. Edward's attempts to send project proposals were ruthlessly swiped into the trash. And yet, through all these dizzying, fast-paced scenes, there was always a soft, pale gold halo quietly grounding him. Whenever Ethan rubbed his aching brow, a steaming mug of milk would steadily appear at the corner of his desk. When his eyes lingered too long on complex financial reports, a pair of long, elegantly sculpted hands would precisely slide the crucial data into his line of sight. The moment their fingertips brushed, That faint white gold radiance would ripple like water, tenderly smoothing away Ethan's frayed nerves. "Cheney, why are you so good to me?" Ethan finally couldn't help but look up, the slight flush at the corners of his eyes carrying a trace of hope he hadn't even noticed himself. Cheney's page, turning paused for a fraction of a second. He lifted his gaze, his strikingly handsome face remarkably gentle. Isn't it perfectly normal for classmates to help one another? That warm, white, gold halo seemed to dim for the briefest moment. Ethan froze, feeling as though a sliver of warmth had been siphoned from his chest, leaving an empty ache. So, just classmates? The storm hit in the third week, just as the project was nearing its close. Funding chain broken, partners withdrawing. The words struck Ethan's spine like a freezing heavy weight. A $30 million gap. Countless hung, up calls, endless dismissive excuses. Deep into the night, thick darkness enveloped the dorm room. Ethan let himself fall heavily onto the soft mattress, staring blankly at the ceiling. His breaths came in ragged, uneven gasps. He buried his fingers deeply into his hair, his eyes laced with exhaustion. A tall silhouette silently blocked the cold moonlight filtering through the window. Cheney had appeared by the bedside without a sound, holding a glass of warm water. Did the project run into trouble? Ethan took the glass. The comforting heat brought a trace of sensation back to his trembling fingertips. Yeah, they pulled out. There is a 30 million shortfall. The air was quiet for 2 seconds. I'll have the investment contracts drawn up tomorrow. Cheney's voice was as unruffled as if he were discussing the weather. Ethan snapped his head up, his clear eyes wide with disbelief. 30 million? No collateral, no conditions? He sat up abruptly, calling out to the man who was just about to turn away. "Cheney, aren't you afraid I won't be able to pay you back?" Cheney halted, slowly looking back over his shoulder. The deep sapphire moonlight filtered through the window pane, tracing the sharp line of his nose and the deep contours of his eyes. He looked exactly like a master artist's sculpture, compassionate and profoundly devoted. "I believe in you." As his deep voice faded, a white gold radiance, richer and warmer than ever before, bloomed around him. The light felt like tangible, golden stardust, wrapping around Ethan softly yet, with an irresistible embrace, completely driving away the deep, seated chill in his bones. Besides, even if you can't pay it back, it doesn't matter. Cheney lowered his long lashes slightly, his profound gaze like a gentle, endless ocean. "I have already given you something far more important than that." Before Ethan could ask what he meant, darkness settled back into the room, leaving only that tender halo lingering beautifully in the air. Something more important than money. What could it be? Ethan tightened his grip on the warm glass, his heart completely losing its rhythm in the quiet night. The warm morning sun cascaded over the newly completed South Side commercial district, refracting a dazzling light of hope. Standing before the floor, ceiling window, Ethan looked at his screen. His shareholding percentage rested securely at 40%. Edward's absolute silence throughout the ordeal made it seem as though he had been entirely erased from this chessboard of power. Everything was progressing flawlessly, according to the script of Ethan's rebirth. Everything, except for that one unpredictable variable. Ethan turned his head, his gaze crossing the office desk to rest on Cheney, who was looking down at a document a few feet away. The impeccably tailored bespoke suit hugged the man's powerful frame, and that guardian-like white gold halo continued to quietly encircle him. What exactly is he after? Ethan gently bit his lower lip, his eyes complex yet incredibly soft. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. If the day ever came when this Enigma asked something of him, he would have no instinct left to refuse. A brief news alert flashed across his screen. Angus had been sentenced. Ethan calmly swiped the notification away. The afternoon sun danced across his fingertips, gilding the soaring financial reports in a brilliant, golden sheen. His mother's worried ramblings over the phone, along with the vicious infighting between Edward and the Kennedy family, were all effortlessly sealed away within this serene light. He was just one step away from reclaiming total control over the Walton family. That tranquility, however, did not last long. The door was forced open with a heavy thud, letting in the biting wind from the hallway. Edward's eyes were deeply sunken, a defeated, bruised shadow clinging to his hollow cheekbones. He leaned against the door frame like a walking shadow, his gaze locked desperately onto Ethan. His voice trembled so violently it felt as though it might shatter at any moment. "Ethan, I remember, in our past life, I sent you to the sanctuary." His legs gave out, and he fell to his knees at Ethan's feet, desperately trying to catch the hem of his shirt. A frantic, agonized red rimmed his eyes. "The company is yours. The Walton family is yours. I beg you, forgive me. Please, give me a chance to make it up to you." Ethan stood bathed in a pillar of warm light, casting his gaze downward. His clear eyes reflected the wretched face below, holding nothing but a freezing, lifeless stillness. "The greatest compensation you can offer me is to stay far away." The air froze for several seconds. In the next moment, the desperate Alpha, pushed to the brink, surged forward with an overwhelming, suffocating presence, forcing Ethan back onto the edge of the bed. "You want to run away? Dream on." As Edward's desperate shout tore through the room, the oxygen seemed to vanish. The once bright sunlight was forcefully warped and swallowed by shadows. A dizzying, intense heat wave rippled through the air. That relentless, overwhelming magnetism pressed heavily against Ethan's senses, forcefully drawing out his deepest, most vulnerable biological instincts, his susceptibility period. "Let go." Ethan's limbs instantly lost their strength as a searing, feverish heat spread through his very bones. He bit down hard on his lower lip, an uncontrollable flushed hue rising to the corners of his eyes in distress. Crash! The solid wood door was thrust open with an unstoppable, sweeping force. Amidst the splintering wood, Chaney strode in, carrying the commanding pressure of a breaking storm. With a sharp gust of wind following his long strides, his overwhelming presence forcibly cast Edward aside. Edward scrambled up from the floor, his turbulent, dark gray aura roaring as it lunged toward Chaney. Yet, Chaney merely tilted his head with effortless grace. In an instant, a blindingly pure, white aurora erupted from Chaney's entire being. The light held no malice, yet it carried the boundless, majestic authority of a true sovereign. The aurora rippled outward, silently like a tidal wave. The moment it made contact, Edward's suffocating, dark storm clouds evaporated like fragile snow under a blazing sun, instantly and completely purified. The completely subdued Alpha slumped to the floor, his lips trembling violently, stripped of even the slightest will to resist. Chaney didn't spare him a single extra glance. He immediately swept the feverishly hot Ethan into his arms, holding him securely against his chest. Ethan's trembling fingers tightly gripped Chaney's crisp collar, burying his flushed, burning face deep into the crook of the man's neck, which radiated that comforting, white, gold shimmer. Edward's anguished cries echoed behind them, only to be completely and definitively sealed away by the decisive closing of the door. Inside a private city estate, the sanctuary room was bathed in a soothing, warm tangerine glow. Ethan was gently lowered onto the vast, soft bed. His reason was melting away under waves of overwhelming, feverish heat. Through a blurred gaze, he saw Chaney's back as the man prepared to pull away, and tears fell against his pillow without warning. Driven purely by instinct, he reached out his weakened arms, wrapping them tightly around the man's solid forearm, his fingertips turning pale from the desperate grip. "Don't go. Chaney, please help me." Chaney's towering frame froze in place. He slowly turned around, his profound eyes swirling with an incredibly deep blend of indulgence and restraint. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh and leaned in, gently resting his warm forehead against Ethan's. In an instant, that soft, white gold aurora completely enveloped them both. "Ethan, this is what you asked for." It was a long, deeply intertwined night. Under the tender comfort of the white gold halo, Ethan rested against the man's broad chest. Listening to that steady, powerful heartbeat, he murmured in a soft haze, "Why me? Do you still remember? That butterfly?" The lens of time shifted back 16 years. In the rigid, stifling backyard of the DuPont estate, a mud-covered 6-year-old Ethan had stubbornly dragged Chaney, who was sitting numbly like a delicate wooden doll, out to catch butterflies. The two of them ran and tumbled in the sunlight, their laughter ringing clear and bright. A slightly crumpled strawberry gummy was pressed into Chaney's cold, sweaty palm by a pair of tiny dirt-smudged hands. The sweetness danced across his tongue, completely melting away the ache of his harsh punishments. That little butterfly named Ethan had flown into the Enigma's barren life that day, and never ever left. The news of Edward entirely losing his grip on reality and being sent to a quiet care facility drifted by like a fallen leaf, brushing the surface of a lake, no longer able to stir even the slightest ripple in Ethan's heart. A magnificent melting gold sunset bathed the floor, to ceiling windows of the Walton Group's top floor in a warm, brilliant tangerine glow. A thunderous round of applause for a unanimous vote echoed through the spacious boardroom. Wearing a crisply tailored suit, Ethan sat securely at the head of the table. In the healing glow of the sunset, his features looked resolute and utterly radiant. As he flipped to the final document, his pen suddenly ran dry. From beside him, an elegantly sculpted hand offered a weighty fountain pen. Chaney stood right behind him, his broad chest pressed closely against the back of the chair. With a deep sense of devotion and overwhelming tenderness, he rested his chin softly in the crook of Ethan's shoulder. "Use mine." Ethan turned his head, meeting those deeply affectionate eyes that were brimming with the colors of the setting sun. A bright, completely healed smile blossomed in his eyes. He took the pen, and in the intertwining dance of golden light and shadow, he confidently signed the name that marked his brilliant rebirth. Ethan.
My heart truly goes out to Ethan in this story. In his past life, he loved his stepbrother with all his heart, only to meet a devastatingly heartbreaking end. Given a second chance at life, he became fiercely determined to rewrite his destiny. Facing Edward, the man he once loved so deeply, he chose to build an unbreakable fortress around his heart and step entirely out of his shadow. Perhaps because the wounds cut so deep, Ethan was forced to grow up in the blink of an eye. He showcased an incredible drive, learning the intricacies of business from the ground up and successfully securing crucial projects. When faced with Angus' malicious rumors, he didn't act on impulse. Instead, he bided his time with quiet resilience, waiting for the perfect moment to deliver a flawless counterattack. Ethan was no longer a fragile flower clinging to someone else for survival. He blossomed into a resilient, rightful heir, truly worthy of his family's legacy. But the moment Ethan stopped yielding, Edward completely shattered. This was because Edward was fundamentally arrogant, domineering, and intensely selfish. Blinded by a thirst for power, he easily discarded their 3 years of quiet affection, exiling Ethan to the cold isolation of the sanctuary. His explosive fury when Ethan finally slipped from his grasp wasn't born out of a sudden, regretful realization of love. At its core, it was simply the unbearable frustration of losing something he believed belonged to him. His eventual downfall feels deeply satisfying. A man who never learned how to cherish, who only knew how to take, is simply unworthy of receiving any love in return. In stark contrast stands Chaney. Despite his prestigious background and status as a top-tier Enigma, he is the complete opposite of Edward. While possessing the most formidable presence, he is overwhelmingly gentle and deeply respectful of boundaries. He is never one for empty words, choosing instead to show his devotion through quiet, unwavering actions. From the simple, caring gestures of offering a warm coat or a glass of water, to unconditionally backing Ethan with $30 million in business capital, and even providing the crucial evidence needed for his counterattack. Chaney's love is never about making demands. Instead, it is an unreserved, unwavering safety net. He is the most tender haven, offering his beloved infinite comfort, peace, and indulgence. His very existence completely healed the deep scars of Ethan's past life, just as it deeply warms my heart as a reader. I truly hope that everyone can find a love that is just as gentle and unconditionally accepting. If you enjoyed this beautiful story, please remember to subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you all next time.